Today I'm going to be talking to you about happiness and religiosity, and if there's a relationship between the two. I feel like we often hear that religious people are happier, but is that really true? Well, we know that one doesn't cause the other one, right? Happiness doesn't cause people to become religious, and religion doesn't cause people to be happy, because there's no way for us to effectively study that. But we can look at if they're related to each other. If, on average, religious people tend to be happier than non-religious people, or vice versa. So let's get into it. First, we'll be looking at happiness. So happiness is defined as frequency of positive emotions, as well as the absence of negative emotions, and the overall well-being or happiness in someone's life. Overall stability, if you will. So on the graph here, we're looking at different measures that are associated with happiness that were used in the studies that I looked at. You see that there's a happiness scale, which looks at the positive emotions, the presence of positive emotions, a depression inventory, which looks at the absence of negative emotions, as well as the NEO-PI, which is a personality inventory that looks at someone's overall stability over their lifetime. So all these different ways to measure one's happiness. Now, looking at religiosity, there's two different main components that are defined by Beer in 2013. So religion is the organized system of beliefs, these practices, these rituals that point towards the sacred or the transcendent, which can be anything from God to ultimate truth to any sort of higher power. Now, looking at spirituality, we're looking at this personal quest to answer questions related to the meaning of life, happiness, well-being, and the relationship or lack thereof with a spiritual, transcendent being. So, spirituality can lead to religion, right? Or religion, the organization, can lead to one's spirituality or quest to answer questions. But both of these things combined is what religiosity encompasses. Another way to look at this is intrinsic versus extrinsic religiosity. So this is how Maltby defined it. And we have intrinsic religiosity, which is deeply personal, right? It is that personal quest, that personal relationship with a sacred or transcendent being, right? Anything from God, gods, to ultimate truth, or seeking out the meaning of life, right? And then extrinsic religiosity is this membership to a group and access to an all-powerful being, right? This provides a social status, a consolation, an ego defense, right? A group to belong to, rather than the intrinsic, which is that personal belief, that personal relationship. So, is there a link between these two things? Looking at this graph, you would say, yes, there's definitely a link, right? There's more in the correlation side than the no correlation side, which is correct, right? There is some link between the two, but the link is relatively weak, and it doesn't really explain everything. So there's only 4 studies that I found that had no correlation between happiness and religiosity. But out of the 16 studies that had some sort of correlation, 6 of them found mediating factors, which I'll define in a moment. But it's important to note that these links aren't necessarily strong, and not all of the papers had only correlations or only no correlations. There was some overlap between the two, and anyone that had a correlation was put into the correlation category. So it may be a little bit skewed in terms of numbers, but it also doesn't show how strong these links actually are. Now, looking at mediating factors, right? What is a mediating factor? It's a third variable that is correlated with both religiosity and with happiness that offers an explanation as to the relationship. And once this factor is accounted for, the relationship between happiness and religiosity disappears, or it goes away, right? It doesn't exist with this mediating factor present, right? So a lot of the studies that I looked at didn't even look for mediating factors, but the ones that did found 4 significant ones that we'll be looking at today. We'll be looking at social interaction, personality, mental health, and physical health. And these 4 factors account for most of the relationship between happiness and religiosity. Not all of it, because there's still factors that we haven't found, and there's still studies being done, but it accounts for a large portion of it. So looking at social interaction, right? Being an active member of a church community can increase one's social capital. Social capital has to do with the amount of quality relationships that someone has, right? This can be anything from the people that you would talk to on a daily basis to close personal friends, right? And not only do you have an increase in social capital within the church community itself, but you also have this increase in social capital in the community, because a lot of religious groups emphasize volunteering and community work as well. So you're able to grow social capital outside of just your religious group. Religious attendance and close personal relationship with God are related to life satisfaction. Even when you take away some of these factors like socioeconomic status or neighborhood or number of friends, you still see that people who have a higher life satisfaction often have a close personal relationship with God or attend religion regularly, and vice versa, right? It was also found by Ellison that people who have a close personal relationship with God will see benefits of that relationship as if it was a human person standing right next to them that they could talk to, right? There's a lot of the same emotional benefits from that relationship. And then Mukherjee found that the more homogeny in a country in terms of religion, so the more people in a country that have the same religion, the happier that those people were on average. So that likely has to do with having people that think similarly to you, or that are involved in the same kind of groups or have the same beliefs as you, allowing you to kind of express yourself more and to be involved in a community that agrees with you in a lot of ways, right? And this shows an increase in belonging and belonging to a group, which is related to extrinsic orientation, like I talked about earlier. And this extrinsic orientation is related to confidence in social interactions. So people who are extrinsically oriented in their religion, who have a lot of value in their social community and in their social status within that community, often see confidence in social interactions, likely due to having this religious group to kind of back them and support them in what they're doing. Religiosity is associated with how much individuals enjoy their time in conversation. So people who are religious often find a lot of enjoyment in just talking to people and in having those small social interactions. It's important to note that religious people do not have more quality social interactions. However, they do tend to have more social interactions, right? These social interactions would be defined by Sandstrom as weak tie interactions. And weak tie interactions are anything that you would see as kind of meaningless or small, right? Think saying hi to a bus driver or chatting with a barista, right? People that you maybe see regularly but don't have a close or intimate relationship with, but you still have these social interactions with them. And those weak tie interactions are associated with happiness. People who have more of these interactions on average are happier in general. And so a lot of religious people have these weak tie interactions, whether it's with people in their community or with people at their church or religious services. So that is associated with happiness as well. Looking at personality characteristics, Robbins notes that there is no correlation between personality as a whole and religion. So think of it like there's no one specific type of person that is religious, and you've got people of all different characteristics who are religious and who aren't religious. Serlu also talks about how values are a stronger predictor of religiosity than your personality characteristics, right? So this makes sense in thinking of, religious groups having shared values and having similar values, that would be strongly correlated with religion, rather than personality, which, as Robbins points out, doesn't really have a relationship with religion. Now, Serlu did find specific traits that are related to religiosity, specifically extrinsic religiosity, right? So ratings of conscientiousness, agreeableness, and neuroticism were all higher in people who also scored high in extrinsic religiosity. And then Robbins found that intrinsic religiosity is related to agreeableness, which is that like kind, helpful, trusting personality. Now, one doesn't cause the other, right? Religion doesn't cause you to be more conscientious or agreeable, right? But it's likely that people of certain traits may be drawn to religion, or religion helps to encourage growth in certain areas, like being responsible or hardworking or kind. But it might be a mix of both, and it might be neither. We don't know. But there is this relationship there where some of these traits show up more in religious people. Personality traits are a good predictor of happiness scores. So people who score higher in conscientiousness, extroversion, and agreeableness, as well as lower neuroticism, are related to happiness, and those people tend to be happier. So two of those traits are seen often in religious people, conscientiousness and agreeableness. Now, Van Capellen did a study on self-transcendent positive emotions, which are things like gratitude, love, peace, and awe, as compared to other positive emotions such as amusement and pride. And they found that these self-transcendent positive emotions, which are highlighted here, are different from the ones right below it, which are the other positive emotions. Now, any line, any horizontal line that crosses or is very close to this vertical dotted line is not significant at all. And really most of the data on this graph are not super significant, but we do see a difference, a consistent difference between the self-transcendent positive emotions and the other positive emotions. So even though this isn't statistically significant, it does point to some sort of difference that should be studied further in terms of what kind of emotions maybe relate to happiness or religion. Looking at mental health, we know that depression is not correlated with religiosity. So depressed people can be religious or they cannot be religious, and there's no consistent relationship there. It's also important to note that religious groups have played both a positive and a negative impact on mental health throughout history, right? We think of some groups as maybe being welcoming to the hurt and the broken, and other time periods or other groups kind of rejecting the demonic, right? Those two both have to do with mental health, and so people feeling more comforted by religious groups is not necessarily related to what we're looking at here, just because there is this difference in how religious groups have interacted with people with mental health disorders, which means that it's not always consistent, and so people don't necessarily look to a religious group as comfort when they have mental health issues. We do know that coping strategies are promoted in religion and religious groups, such as prayer, meditation, and finding peace and solace. Those are all related to things that are reinforced and taught by religious groups, which lead to a reduction in stress, a reduction in depression, and a reduction in sadness. Religious attitudes and coping with stress are also associated with happiness. So people who are able to cope with stress better are happier on average, and people with more positive religious attitudes are happier on average. And Morris did a study on physically sick people, so people that were either terminally or chronically sick, went on a pilgrimage, which is a religious trip, to Lourdes, France, which is a holy site in the Catholic faith. And they measured the participants' depression before their trip, 1 month after their trip, and 10 months after their trip. and they found a consistent and significant decline in depression across that time period. So over those 10 months, they found a decline in depression. It's important to note that this is a small sample size and there's no comparison group, but it is interesting to see that there is consistent results among these people who were visiting a site that they believed to be very holy and then felt this decline in depression following that, even if their illness wasn't changed. Looking at health outcomes, physical health is related to happiness. So people who are more physically active are happier on average. Religious attendance is also associated with positive health outcomes. So people who attend religious services are more likely to be happy on average. Social capital also acts as this mediator between religion and physical health. So if you think of that triangle graph again, right, you have social capital as this mediating factor here. Religion is also typically against a lot of high-risk behaviors, so things like drinking, smoking, drugs, and unprotected sex are often pushed back against by religion, which leads to people leading healthier lifestyles because they're avoiding these high-risk behaviors. Religion also offers, like I mentioned, teachings to cope with stress, and we know that stress negatively impacts one's physical health, so reduction in stress can help increase their physical health. Religious faith can also act as this buffer between trauma and well-being, so religion kind of helps buffer some of the impacts of trauma on one's physical well-being. So in conclusion, happiness is something that can be pursued. We can work towards being happier. We can try to lead a happier lifestyle. But it's also important to know that happiness is relatively stable over the lifetime, right? This allows us to bounce back from negative experiences, and it helps us to kind of keep a consistent baseline of happiness, but it fluctuates, right? Things fluctuate up and down, and increased happiness is something that can be worked towards and pursued. It's also important to note that Sang-Ho found that spirituality may have more of an influence on happiness than religion itself. So that personal drive, that personal motivation towards religion may have more of an impact on one's health and happiness and well-being than belonging to a religious institution or a religious organization alone, right? So, like I've mentioned throughout this presentation, there is this small correlation between religion and happiness, but there's a lot of mediating factors involved in this, right? So we know with religiosity and happiness, there's this correlation, but with all these mediating factors, when these show up, the relationship between religiosity and happiness goes away, because we can account for why there's this relationship here, and it's these other things, not the relationship between the two itself, but the influence of social interaction and physical health and coping mechanisms that play a role here, right? So religiosity doesn't cause happiness, and happiness doesn't cause religiosity, but religiosity promotes these aspects of health and happiness that impact one's overall happiness and well-being. And if you take away religiosity from the equation, you still have these factors that are influencing one's happiness, right? You can be happy without being religious. You often engage in these behaviors. You often have coping mechanisms or high social interaction or good physical health that interact or relate to your overall happiness and your well-being. Often people who are religious or who join a religious group and become happier due to the influence of these other factors, right? Due to this promoted lifestyle of being healthier and having these coping mechanisms, they find themselves being happier, which works as almost like a feedback loop, where then they go back to the religiosity, the spirituality, the religion aspects of it, because they found more happiness there due to this influence in their lifestyle. So in conclusion, religion tends to promote a lifestyle that can lead one to be happier and have higher well-being, but you don't need happiness, or you don't need religion to lead a happy life. But religion does provide a framework to help you lead a happier life.